everybody. It's here. It's 3 a.m. in the morning, and we're talking across the the Pacific and across country to Toronto. We're sitting here with Megan Ramos from the Intensive Dietary Management Program. Megan, what did you get up to this weekend? You were just mentioning it's about freezing.
We got up to lots of snow this weekend. So we kind of hibernated a little bit, but it was a good chance to make some bone broth to help us prep for our upcoming fast. We're doing our first IDM group fast starting on Thursday of this week. So we stayed inside like bears going through hibernation to avoid the outdoor weather this weekend, and our place smelled like Thanksgiving with all of the broth. So we made some good chicken broth.
Nice. Do you have a particular recipe, anything that you like to add in?
I really like to make my bone broth super bland, and there's a reason for that, because when you go to reheat it, you can season it however you want. So each cup or bowl of broth that you have can be very different afterwards. But when you're making these big pots of broth, if you season it very strongly, you can't get away from that flavor. So every cup you have is going to taste exactly the same. And the monotony of that drives people crazy. So I just like making a bland broth. So chicken bones, some raw unfiltered apple cider vinegar, some celery, some carrots, green onion, mushrooms, salt and pepper, just keeping it pretty basic. And then I like to change it depending on my mood and what I'm craving each time I go to drink it. So I really encourage people to make it as bland as possible.
Great. And so how long is this fast going to be, and what do you use the broth for? How do you use the broth?
So the this particular fast is going to go from Wednesday night until Sunday at lunchtime. So about 4 days of fasting. So we're doing it on our IDM membership community, our first communal fast. Some people prefer to fast on weekdays, and some people prefer to fast on weekends. So we're sort of overlapping with 2 weekdays and then the weekend, just so we can sort of try to accommodate everyone. For me, I often try to just do water fasting when I am fasting nowadays, because my goals have now changed. I'm looking for more disease prevention, so things like cancer prevention, neurological disease prevention. We have some hereditary cancers in my family, dementia and Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease is in my family. My family's got everything. So looking for more disease prevention. So my goals through fasting is to achieve a state called autophagy, where you get some cellular recycling, you get rid of bad proteins in the body that can cause and contribute to some of these diseases. You can repair your mitochondria. For that kind of fast, you need to be pretty strict on your consumption of fluids, salt and water. But my husband and I, we got into weight training pretty intensely this past September. We'll be traveling for a lot of March. So we're going to the gym every day, except for Wednesdays. In the month of February. So for me, when we're doing that intense weight training, electrolytes are really important. So for this particular fast, since it is an extended fast of about 4 days, I'm going to use the bone broth to supplement for electrolytes before my fast, before my workout and after my workout during this fast. So that's why we wanted to have some bone broth ready for this particular fast this week.
That's fantastic. What sort of weight training are you doing? Are you doing a interval training, a CrossFit training, or in a sort of Olympic powerlifting style of things?
Oh, geez, it's more like CrossFit.
Yeah.
And I'm such a beginner, but I've mastered the deadlift now, and I'm getting better working out some mobility issues that I have now that I'm in my mid-30s. That's really sort of scary thing for me to say, but all of the stupid activities I did in my 20s are now catching up to me, and my body is falling apart in my mid-30s. So just focusing on mobility, but it's more like CrossFit training.
So what was the motivation to begin weight training in your 30s?
So for me, when I turned 30, I'll be 34 this year. When I turned 30, I decided to go for a DEXA body composition scan. It was my first one. And I went, and it also gives you a bone mass density score. And mine was very poor.
Mhm.
So I attribute that to my genetics. Every woman in my family over the age of 40 has been diagnosed with severe osteoporosis. My mother actually fractured her hip at the age of 36 without even falling. Like, her bones were just that brittle.
Mhm.
That regular activity resulted in a broken hip. So I have poor genetics on both sides of my family when it comes to that, but also excess consumption of phosphoric acid from drinking diet sodas nonstop, pretty much throughout my youth and throughout my 20s. So I was gifted this wonderful diagnosis of osteoporosis on my my 30th birthday. Don't ever do tests like that on major birthdays. It's a bad life decision. But it really sort of motivated me, and I wasn't in a position where I could really do weight training at that time. I had some cardiac surgery and was doing extensive traveling, and it just didn't work out. So I did extended fasts because when you fast at certain intervals, your body releases quite a lot of growth hormone, and that can help rebuild lost bone mass. So just through fasting, I was able to go from quite moderately severe osteoporosis to very mild osteopenia. But I still haven't been able to sort of get into that normal bone mass density range. I'm sitting at that osteopenia state. So I'm 34, and next year we're going to start trying to expand our family, and I would like to have really good bone mass density before I get pregnant, just sort of based on my family history. So weight training for me, of course, it's great to put on muscle mass. It will help me lose a little bit more body fat that I would like to lose, but mostly it's for my bone health, and also, just improving my mobility now that I'm getting older, and I'm seeing that my mobility is not as great as I think it should be for someone my age or someone even much older than me. So those are the reasons why I started doing weight training, just getting my body ready for the next stage in its life, and to be able to handle all of the trials and tribulations like pregnancy that come along with it.
Wow, best of luck.
Thanks.
I'm expecting my first child next month, so it's an exciting time.
Oh, cool. Congratulations.
Thank you. I touched on what you do. Who is Megan Ramos today? She's 34, obviously, and into if you could explain it a bit better, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, no problem. So aside from being a 34-year-old Canadian with poor bone mass density, I run a clinic with my colleague, Dr. Jason Fung, in Toronto, Ontario, called the Intensive Dietary Management Program. Several years ago, I was experiencing lots of health issues. My whole life, actually, has been sort of bombarded with one issue after another. I was 12 when I was diagnosed with fatty liver disease, and I was 14 when I was diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is called PCOS in short, for abbreviation. And polycystic ovarian syndrome is sort of like diabetes of the ovaries, and fatty liver disease is like diabetes of the liver. But I was underweight, and my doctors didn't understand why I had these conditions if I was underweight, because these were conditions usually associated with people who were obese. But because my body mass index, my BMI, was considered underweight, they were very perplexed. But even though I was technically underweight, I had brittle bones, and I was not very muscular. So I was just essentially a little sack of fat. So even though the number on the scale in ratio in comparison to my height was very little, all I was a little sack of fat. That's my first initial diagnosis with metabolic syndrome. So I remained a little sack of fat through my teenage years and my early 20s. The PCOS just became worse as I got older, and the fatty liver disease, that didn't change too much. But I was more concerned about the PCOS, as we've talked about, and looking forward to becoming a mom in the next couple of years. So this threat of infertility really scared me. So I saw a whole bunch of specialists. They started talking about how low my hormones were. I should try to conceive sooner than later. I'm probably going to enter menopause early. They talked about freezing my eggs and all kinds of unpleasant things and very expensive things too, for me to have a family later on. And it broke my heart, and everyone was just sort of perplexed why this very skinny girl was having and suffering from polycystic ovarian syndrome. But I was just a little sack of fat. I was 97 pounds at 5'2", and I was morbidly obese. So in my mid-20s, it caught up with me, and I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and I had just become a large sack of fat at that point. I had gained almost 100 pounds or 45 kilos, and I was totally miserable, absolutely miserable. So I'm a clinical researcher by trade, and my colleague, Jason Fung, he's a kidney specialist. So I studied kidney disease, and most of my research focused around monitoring the progression of patients' kidney disease so we could try to find better markers to determine these different changes in kidney disease, to see if we could maybe find a marker that would help us detect kidney disease much earlier. So we would initially start out with a healthy group of patients that had some indications that kidney disease might be coming down the line. So we could monitor their blood markers and see if we could point out or figure out any other relationships in these blood markers and their kidney function, so we could diagnose it earlier. Almost all of these patients that I worked with had diabetic-related kidney disease. Almost all of our kidney disease patients have kidney disease because of diabetes. And as their diabetes got worse, their kidney disease got worse. It was hand in hand. And there was nothing that the kidney doctor could do for their patient. If the diabetes is getting worse, which it did in every case, their kidneys got worse. And it was just a matter of doing your best to maintain the kidney function with a few limited medications out there, and just monitoring their progression until they needed dialysis, or seeing if they were eligible for a transplant. But there was no reversal of kidney disease. So it was my job to essentially watch people die from diabetes and obesity. And here I am, 27 years old, being told I'm diabetic, having this weight that I couldn't figure out how to lose. I saw fancy dietitians. I was working out like a maniac. I was eating like 800 calories a day. I wasn't eating any fat, and I just kept getting fatter. And it was really frustrating for me, and I didn't want to be a statistic. And Dr. Jason Fung, he's a few years older than me. And he is sort of feeling defeated. He was just watching people die too. And a friend of his had talked about how she had done some fasting and had lost some weight and had lowered her blood sugar levels. Her reason for fasting was more spiritual, but she noted these changes in her body and in her lab test results, and thought that they might be interesting to my colleague. So Jason started doing some research on fasting and religion. Why is fasting's been around for thousands and thousands of years. It's not a new concept by any means, but why did people do it for thousands and thousands of years? Was there a good reason why we stopped doing it in the 1900s? So he did some research, and we had a conversation about it. It was pretty interesting. So I started fasting. And so I was our guinea pig, and I had an incredible amount of success. I've lost 86 pounds. I totally reversed my diabetes. I no longer have fatty liver disease. I have the fertility hormones of someone in their early teenage years. So infertility is not an issue. There's no more PCOS to contend with. So I'm going to be able to have kids, and it's been really remarkable. I've been given my life back through fasting, and of course, following a more low carbohydrate diet. I follow personally a ketogenic diet, but that's been an evolution over the last 5 years. So we opened up a clinic within our nephrology practice to help with our diabetic patients at giving them a shot, to not need dialysis potentially, or to do their best to stop their diabetes now from destroying their kidneys. So we had a tremendous amount of success in office. And now we've become an online program that enables us to help people all over the world. So people don't have to come to Toronto, Canada to receive treatment at our clinic. So we have a team of experts who Jason and I have trained personally and have worked with too for many years on a more nephrology level. To become experts in therapeutic fasting and help coach people through how to fit it into their lifestyle and how to achieve the results that they want to achieve clinically at the same time. Jason and I still have a very small in-office program in Toronto where we are now experimenting with how different conditions can be affected by intermittent fasting. So we have more cancer patients with more neurological problems like multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's disease, dementia. We have some women now, we're doing a small pilot with women with these prolactinomas. So prolactinoma is a tumor on the pituitary gland that causes your hormones to be all out of whack. And the result of this is that your body always thinks that it's pregnant. So you never have regular menstrual periods, you're always lactating. So for these women, they can't get pregnant because their body's under the assumption that they always are. And we're having some really neat success in all areas that we're looking into. Alzheimer's disease and dementia is a little bit more tricky to navigate with fasting. With Alzheimer's disease, people forget that they're supposed to fast, or they forget, that they're on a fasting day, they forget when they eat. So just sort of seeing what a ketogenic diet can do with Alzheimer's patients. We've had more success with patients with dementia fasting. So we're trying to see what the scope of this intermittent fasting thing can do. So I am a clinical researcher who now specializes in therapeutic fasting in a clinical setting.
Fantastic.
That was a long answer for a short question.
That was perfect, and it's prompted a couple of questions. First off, you mentioned at the start there about diet sodas. Do you think that was your cause of fatty liver, or have you come up with sort of an idea around what might have been prompting that condition?
At such a young age, I believe I developed fatty liver because I think I was born with metabolic syndrome.
Right.
Something people always say to me, well, you're diabetic because it's in your DNA. And I'll say, well, how come my grandmother didn't develop diabetes until she was 74? And how come my father was 55? And why was I 27? It clearly, yes, I do have a family predisposition for it genetically. That's not a question there. But how come there's now these huge age gaps? In my grandparents' generation, no one was diagnosed with diabetes until they were over the age of 70. Diabetes was an elderly disease. And then in my parents' generation, even among all my friends in my social circle, all in their 50s, like they're all being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So then it's becoming a younger person's disease. And now the number of people that come into the clinic or join our online program are around my age, and they have type 2 diabetes. So something drastically had to change in our diet, and how my grandmother ate, how my father ate, and how I ate growing up were all very different. In the late 1970s is sort of when the U.S., changed their food guidelines, and a lot of the world follows suit after the U.S. makes a large declaration. So saturated fat's bad for you. Fat is bad for you. You need to eat a low-fat diet. And they put a lot of pressure on the World Health Organization to promote these guidelines too, which had a wider impact on other countries in establishing food guidelines. So I was born in 1984. So I grew up on baby formula, where the first ingredient on the label was cornstarch. I grew up in the era of McDonald's being on every street corner in the city of Toronto, with two very busy parents, where it was very easy to order in pizza on Monday night and Chinese food on Tuesday night, and just swing by McDonald's on the way home on Wednesday. I was part of the generation too that snacked. Talking to my grandmother before she passed, she was funny. So she was a spirited woman, and she was the only person that in my family that initially supported me. She said, "You know, Megan, your dad didn't get fat till he moved out of my home." And she said he was never allowed to snack before dinner. He was never allowed to snack after dinner unless it was a very special occasion. We had dessert on the weekends. He never went to school with a cooler full of treats to have, you know, at his morning recess and his afternoon recess break. Food was nutrition for the body. And she said even the same with her. She didn't, you know, get fat and get sick till she got used to sort of getting this habit of snacking. And her life got busy as she got older. My grandfather was really sick. She had 4 children. She started working full time. And she said, you know, a bag of potato chips at 10 o'clock at night became comforting to her later on in life. And she said that's when she started to get sick. So I grew up always eating that way. I grew up in the era of Costco, where my mother would go to Costco and buy us each our own bag of potato chips from Costco, and then these giant bags. So I think I've just had metabolic syndrome from a very young age, and that's why we're seeing these conditions occur much earlier. You know, in the United States alone, in 2015, there was over 10,000 children diagnosed with type 2 diabetes under the age of 10. Like, that's crazy, because now it's a disease of children, type 2 diabetes. Over 8,000 children in 2015 in the US had bariatric surgery. And that's just unheard of, but they want to do it younger. So I think it's just a reflection of the changing times as to why my metabolic syndrome crept in on me at the age of 12 rather than creeping in at the age of 52 or 72, just because I grew up with terrible food guidelines from the start, whereas previous generations didn't.
Nice. You're looking at intermittent fasting and in a lot of cases ketogenic diet. You mentioned that with Alzheimer's patients. Dr. Karen's in New Zealand. I was watching a video from her lecture at Low Carb Down Under. She was talking about how that can almost mimic fasting. She showed a week recordings of her blood sugar and ketones, and her first 2 days where she did 24-hour fasts. Her ketones went way up, but then she was able to maintain that off very, very easily. Can you speak on how it can mimic the fasting sort of experience?
It can and it can't. So likewise too, my ketones and my blood glucose levels are very identical on a fasting day and an eating day from a ketogenic diet. So there's a lot of hormonal changes that occur when you're fasting that don't necessarily occur when you're following a ketogenic diet. So I think a ketogenic diet's changed. Like my husband follows it. I follow it strictly. I don't know if I would have married my husband, to be perfectly honest, if he wasn't going to follow this way of life. I think it's a very important diet for maintaining health and also improving some markers. But the fasting really affects you hormonally on a much deeper level. The fluctuations that you see in production of human growth hormone when you're fasting, you don't get that while following a ketogenic diet. You don't get as severe of an insulin reduction too. So when you're following a ketogenic diet, you're definitely not spiking your internal insulin levels, but you're not reducing them. And in a lot of cases of metabolic syndrome and Alzheimer's disease is just like type 3 diabetes, they're calling it nowadays. You have these conditions, they manifest because there's toxic levels of insulin in the body already. So a ketogenic diet won't raise that level higher. And initially, when you follow a ketogenic diet, you'll lose some body fat. And when body fat reduction, you do see a reduction in the insulin levels. But sometimes it's just not dramatic enough to treat people who are who are very sick. So people who have a long-standing history of diabetes, a long-standing history of obesity, or who suffer from more serious conditions like Alzheimer's disease, fatty liver disease. Sometimes a ketogenic diet just isn't enough. And I think the fasting definitely helps turbocharge or accelerate the benefits of a ketogenic diet, because it has a much more dramatic impact on these hormone levels. So you see that reduction of insulin going down to normal. My baseline fasting insulin was 304 picomoles per liter. It's now 11 picomoles per liter on my January blood work. And a large part of that is to do with the fasting. So the fasting has more of an impact on the insulin levels, and also the human growth hormone production, I think is very important, especially nowadays. We're seeing so many men diagnosed with osteoporosis later on in life. And as we age, we start to lose muscle mass. So this production of growth hormone periodically throughout the fast can definitely help sustain muscle mass and help grow muscle mass as we get older. And we see that with a lot of patients in office too. I'll have a lot of these older men who are excited to show me their biceps and triceps, and they're like, look, all we've done is shovel snow. But they're saying they look better in their 60s than they did in their 20s, and that's largely attributed to the growth hormone production. So I do think there are other benefits of fasting, but I think a ketogenic diet is extremely important for prevention of disease, and I definitely think it's an important tool in the treatment of disease, but I think it is just one of several tools in the treatment of disease.
Great. And this is good because you've got your own experience of type 2 diabetes. Often when you tell people about first going low carb, and you don't even mention ketogenic, and now you're talking fasting, they panic that they're going to be hypo. Can you talk to that? Because yes, it is a problem, especially if you're on insulin or insulin secreting stuff, but I guess that's where the intensive dietary management comes in.
Yeah, so it's very important to work with a healthcare provider that can help you navigate. So if someone comes into our clinic, we don't do the keto and the fasting together off the bat. The diet, I mean, people have these long-standing relationships with food, and these habits when it comes to food that are deeply ingrained, and these cultural relationships with food that are very important to them. So when we mention fasting, they often like that because it's easier to not eat than to try to redevelop their diet from scratch. So we find more often are much more willing to just go for days without eating than trying to overhaul their entire diet. So we usually focus on that with the patient first, and then we bring in the diet. Usually people start to feel so well on their fasting days, and then they revert back to their old foods on their eating days, and they feel so horrendous, and they want to feel good. People naturally want to feel good. So then they're more willing and motivated to start working on developing better food habits. But it's really tough. You know, there's cultural significance of certain foods in various regions. There's that emotional connection to food, that reward mechanism with food. So that takes a lot of time. I've been doing intermittent fasting for 7 years. The first 2, I was able to go low carb. My second year was very low carb. And then my ketogenic diet, year 3 was sort of a half low carb, half keto diet. And now it's evolved into a full-blown ketogenic diet. But despite my albino appearance, I'm actually mostly Italian. So I grew up I don't look like my family. I look like the milkman's daughter. But things like, I haven't had pasta in 2 years, and that's not because I'm putting some sort of restriction on myself. from a food item that I ate about 4 times a week for the first 27 years of my life. It's just because I don't care for it anymore. So I find that people, as they start to develop better habits, it contributes to more better habits. And then that really changes your motivation. Now, when I want something for comfort, I really try not to comfort eat, but I'm more likely to go towards, some chicken wings, or to go towards, a nice bacon and egg dish for comfort food, rather than going for the pasta. And to me, it's totally bizarre that this change happened in me. So a lot of people, because they're just doing first the fasting and then sort of the diet, it's not too much at once. So we're not too terribly concerned about them going super hypoglycemic. Of course, there's always the odd patient that wants to be perfect and jumps in with both feet and does everything right away. Usually we see them in follow-up very quickly after their initial consultation, so we can determine what kind of approach they are taking this. Our trajected approach is that they'll start with the fasting, and then as their diet improves, we'll deal with the medications and their diet at that time. But there's maybe about 1 out of every 20 individuals goes super gung-ho, actually goes home and throws out everything that has refined sugar in it, gets rid of all of their bread, and just stocks up on bacon and eggs and sardines. So we gauge that really quickly, so we can adjust their medications accordingly to prevent them from going hypoglycemic. But even at a baseline, in our clinic, Jason Fung, he gives them very specific medication instructions for their eating days and their fasting days. And usually people are quite shocked at how reduced their medication is on their fasting days. So that comforts them, and knowing if they're taking, only a quarter of the insulin, for example, that they would regularly take, and they're used to their blood sugar levels being higher anyways, they feel pretty comfortable that they're not going to go hypoglycemic. And usually they don't. Every now and then we have one patient whose blood sugar levels go low, and we encourage them just to break their fast and just to continue eating until they come in for their next appointment, and always let us know, but just to continue eating till we can adjust their medications. But more often than not, it's not a problem. In our clinic, Jason is the medical director and I'm the executioner of the program. And Jason, he likes to have his patients' blood sugar levels run between about 8 and 10 millimoles per liter. And most in Canada, doctors usually like to keep their patients' blood sugar levels controlled somewhere between about 5 and 7 when they're diabetic and on medication. And normal here in Canada is 3.6 to 5.5. But even on medication, endocrinologists and family practitioners here like to keep them between 5 and 6. So a lot of our patients do feel comfortable with fasting when they know that their doctor is going to be letting their blood sugar levels run a little bit high. So he'll often adjust the medications too on eating days, just to let the blood sugar levels run a little bit high. People's biggest concern with that is, well, having blood sugar levels from 8 to 10 cause damage. Well, in the long term, yes. If your blood sugar levels were always going to be between 8 and 10, 5 years down the road, you might see some kidney damage. There might be some cardiovascular disease related damage. But the idea with our patients, and we tell them, is that they're supposed to be being proactive in executing this fasting and adjusting their diet, so their blood sugar levels should come down. So they usually see it, within a month, they start to notice their blood sugar levels coming down on the reduced medication, and then we'll reduce the medications again, and they're more comfortable with them running a little bit higher because they see them coming down on a month-to-month basis when we do their blood work. So that's very, very comforting for them. Of course, there are patients who can't be compliant for whatever reason. I have one patient, he lost his wife and his son, and then 2 weeks later, his other son was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And life was just very crazy for him, and he was not going to be able to fast or eat soundly emotionally. He just was very honest about that with us. So Dr. Fung increased his medications to keep his blood sugar levels sort of at 5 to 6 during this stressful time. And we told him to come in before, like when he's ready to do this, before he starts, so we can assess his blood sugar levels, do his blood work, and talk about reducing his medications before he starts fasting again. So as long as we know our patients are being consistent with their fasting, if life circumstances permit them to be compliant with the diet, then we're okay with them running a little bit on the higher side. So we will, in our clinic, Jason will initially reduce the medications to have their sugars be between 8 and 10. They naturally start to come down. Once they come down and we're seeing more 6s and 7s, Jason will further reduce the medication to bring them back up to 8 to 10. And then once they're off of all medications, of course, the goal is to get them within the normal range. So seeing more sugars of around 4 millimoles per liter in that case.
Fantastic. And from my perspective, if someone came in with 8 to 10, I'd be a little bit nervous, but it'd be great to hear them say, "Oh no, I'm doing a fasting protocol. I've changed my diet," and that's sort of the hope for me, that when a diabetic comes in for their eye exam, I've been diagnosed with high blood sugar and I'm working on bringing that down and getting my medications down, instead of I don't know what I'm taking, I don't know what my blood sugar is. So this yeah, definitely sounds like a excellent program, and something that I've definitely been sharing your guys' website and the work you're doing with some of my patients here in New Zealand. For somebody such as myself who has, like you, a family history of type 2 diabetes, often when I tell people that I'm on a fast, whether it's intermittent or an extended fast, people sort of say, "Oh, I could never do that. By 11 a.m. I'm starving." Firstly, why is that everybody's starving and they're snacking? And two, what is it actually about our endogenous levels of glucose that mean that we are fine and we're not going to be falling asleep, you know?
Well, we have lots of stored food in our bodies. So if a patient comes in and sits across from me and says, "I can't fast, my body's going to enter starvation mode," I will sort of, indicate that they've got excess, food in their tummy. So we really try to educate these people and explain to them what that body fat actually is. It's essentially stored energy that they haven't used. So when someone comes in and I'll say, in your belly, it's like a refrigerator, and that refrigerator inside of it, it's that extra half a pizza that you ate in 1992. It's that, extra piece of pie that you had at Thanksgiving dinner last year. You have lots of food energy in you, and your body is just going to fuel off of that food energy during the fast, so you won't be starving. Now, most people, it's the more mental aspect of how to handle, the fear of starvation. Physically, a lot of our patients know that they're going to be okay. We sort of explain to them about this excess fuel and how it's stored in their body, and most people understand that. We talk to our patients, and particularly those that are afraid of losing muscle mass. And this is one of Jason Fung's analogies that I think is very good. And it's a cabin in the woods scenario. So if you're at a cabin in the woods in the dead of winter, in true Canada, not in Toronto, we're very wimpy here, but in true Canada, where it can get very cold, and you have 100 pieces of chopped up firewood outside the cabin, and you want to make a fire, are you going to use the firewood when you have so much firewood, or are you going to hack apart the sofa, the couch that you would otherwise be sitting on, be sleeping on, laying on to read, or sitting on to have a discussion with your partner, or your family, or friends? What would you burn in the fire to make a fire? And everyone would say, well, the firewood. You've got 100 pieces of firewood. You would use the firewood. You wouldn't break down the sofa. Sofas are very, very expensive, and they're very functional. So unless you had no firewood and it was in dire straits, then only then maybe would you hack up the sofa and use that to create a fire. So our muscles are very functional. They serve a purpose, and they're very expensive, just like sofas are. And firewood is cheap, and its only purpose is to create a fire. Just like our stored body fat, especially around our midsection is, it's just stored fuel. Its only purpose is to fuel our body. Otherwise, it's just sort of sitting there lying around promoting disease. So if you have a lot of stored fuel, you're going to be using that instead of breaking down important structures in your body that are very expensive and important to maintain. So a lot of people, that analogy seems to really resonate with them, and they feel a little bit more confident fasting. We talked to them too about using certain things as appetite suppressants, like peppermint coffee, raw unfiltered apple cider vinegar, green tea, regular coffee. I mean, these things all have appetite suppressing properties to them. And sometimes it might just be a placebo effect with the patient too. But usually we encourage them to try it for a week first and see how it goes. Jason will always say, what do you have to lose? Honestly, at this point, what do you have to lose? Your diabetes is getting worse. You're getting on more and more medications. Your blood pressure is now out of control. Your kidneys are starting to develop damage from those sugars. What do you have to lose for trying this for 1 to 2 weeks? And I'll talk to them about using these appetite suppressing fluids to help get them through, that 10 a.m., 11 a.m. snack time, and to help them get through the evening time, by taking something like peppermint tea that has no caffeine in it, and talk to them about, the cultural use of peppermint as an appetite suppressing property for hundreds of years. So whether it actually really has an impact on their appetite or not, a lot of people come back and they say, hey, it's just not that difficult to do. And they're getting results, and that will just drive them to continue fasting more and more regularly.
Nice. You spoke about your Italian heritage in your family, and then your husband there. You don't know if you would have married him if he wasn't on ketogenic diet. And family is so important, and often they can be a little bit resistant to the things that you do. How do you or how do you approach it with your patients to communicate the message forward without sounding like a zealot that you see people talk about sugar's poison, which could possibly be true, but what sort of things do you pass on to your patients?
I share with them my experience. My father is a lawyer, and when I first started fasting, I was actually living with him temporarily, both him and my mother, and they thought I was insane because I flat out said the phrase fasting, I'm fasting. And I thought he was going to try to get power of attorney over me in court. Like, they were really scared. So then I tried with my friends. I went out to dinner with a group of friends, my age group, and I thought, okay, I'm going to say that I'm doing this fasting thing. Again, they all thought I was trying to commit suicide slowly. So I realized I had to change the semantics of it, and change it into something else. So I went out to dinner with a second group of friends one night, and they said, "Oh, you look fantastic." And I said, "Thank you." And I said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm doing like a tea detox." I saw on social media that celebrities like Jessica Alba and other younger celebrities were all promoting these like detoxes. And so I started telling them about my detoxes or my teas. So I'm like, I drink peppermint tea to help with bloating and to help with gas. And I drink, this green tea in the morning that energizes me. And all my friends thought it sounded fabulous. And they're like, we saw so-and-so on Instagram, doing a detox too. And they said, so you're just drinking tea? And I said, well, I drink water too. And they're like, that's fantastic. So I learned really quickly that how I phrased it to people made a big difference. So detoxing or detoxing or time-restricted eating works a lot better when you're trying to explain this to new people. So we usually recommend that people just sort of approach it cautiously with their family and friends and coworkers when their community is not really supportive of the notion of fasting. So saying time-restricted eating usually goes over better with people, or a detoxing or like detoxing, that usually garners a lot more positive results. So we talk to our patients about the semantics, and also Jason says like the number one rule of the fasting club is to never tell anyone that you're fasting. So not that we encourage our patients, our clients to become pathological liars, but I've always found that it's best to lead by example fairly quietly. And once you've garnered a little bit more interest, then you can sort of, be more bold with it. So I learned with my own family, who are really frightened by this, that I needed to be cautious of what I said, and I just needed to lead by example. And well, my father, who wanted to get power of attorney over me and have me committed because he thought I was going to develop this terrible eating disorder, he lost 70 pounds last year from intermittent fasting, and he brought his blood sugar levels down. His A1C was below 6, so back in the normal range. Leading by example, not really rubbing it in anyone's faces. It's still very new. And when you try to rub it in people's faces, it rubs them the wrong way. So we usually tell people just, keep quiet, don't overshare, use phrases like time-restricted eating or detoxing. And when people approach you and see how successful you are, that's the best way of spreading the news, and then open up to them a little bit then. When it came to my own father, he said, I can't dispute how great you look and how amazing your blood test results are, and you've been able to maintain this for years, when he's lost and gained 100 pounds in his life more times than I can count. So the evidence will speak for itself as long as you're doing a good job leading by example, and you don't have to rub it in the face of your friends and family. That's usually the worst thing that you can do. So be mindful of your words and be mindful of how much you share at the start.
Absolutely. What is the importance of blood work, and what do your patients generally monitor?
So in our program, we recommend blood work to be done every 3 months and then every 6 months. So every 3 months, we sort of just check your blood counts, your electrolytes, minerals like calcium, phosphorus, magnesium. Magnesium is a terrible blood test, though, here in Canada, so it doesn't really tell anyone about their magnesium levels. We just assume that everyone's deficient pretty much here in North America. So those, we check A1C every 3 months. And fasting glucose. Every 6 months, we check fasting insulin levels, C-peptide levels. The C-peptide levels just tell us how well your pancreas is functioning. Most of our patients have very high C-peptide levels because they're overproducing insulin in response to their standard North American diet that's very high in carbohydrates. And we do a lipid panel every 6 months as well. We don't do it more often than that because there's so much unknown about what true numbers mean. Is having a high HDL sort of is good for men, but is it that good for women? We don't really know, and there's not. Cholesterol is something that still very much scares everybody, but we don't really know what these results sort of mean. So we're more interested in your triglyceride levels, to be perfectly honest, when we do a lipid panel. We don't run the fancy lipid panel here, the NMR lipo profile that sort of tells you how many large LDL particles you have, how many small ones, and your insulin resistance score. Unfortunately, unfortunately, that's not something that the Canadian government offers yet, and Canadian labs do. In Canada, we can outsource it to the United States, and for a fee that's not covered by our insurance here. So I'll do it once a year. A lot of patients will do it once a year just to sort of get particle size. But I'm not too worried about my cholesterol levels because we don't really know what they mean yet. So I focus on my triglycerides, my insulin, and inflammatory markers. So something else that we check every 6 months is a high sensitivity C-reactive protein. Usually if the insulin and the high sensitivity C-reactive protein are low and the triglycerides are low, I'm very much at peace, with whatever the rest of the cholesterol numbers are. And that's how we sort of judge it with our current patients right now. So we do everything at baseline and then repeat it every 3 months or 6 months. If someone is doing longer fasts and they're one of our office patients, because of our great public health care system here, we will do their blood work more on a weekly basis just to assess their kidney function, assess their liver values, and their blood sugar levels and then electrolyte levels on a weekly basis during longer fasts.
Nice. And so Verta Health released their 1-year results last week, and that was one of the things they touched on, that they did have an increase in LDL but a greater increase in HDL.
Mm-hmm.
But they were key. One of the key things that they promoted was that the ApoB was down, and like you say, the C-reactive protein was down, as well as all the rest losing weight, lowering HbA1c. Lots of people have been going after that LDL level. Is anybody sort of going after Dr. Fung or your clinic around the cholesterol?
No. Usually, I think a lot of the general practitioners that work with us are more aware that things are changing, and there's a huge lack of understanding when it comes to cholesterol right now. So if Jason is to take someone off of a statin, we don't get any negative feedback from any of our colleagues. In our clinic, because there's so much left unknown, Jason, if the patient has a history of a heart attack or a stroke or has had bypass surgery, he leaves them on the statin, tries to bring them down to a smaller dose. In our clinic, when patients are fasting and they initially lose a lot of weight, and then their weight loss stabilizes. So it's not that their weight stabilizes, their weight loss stabilizes. So it's not uncommon for someone to, within the first couple of months, to lose something like 25 or 30 pounds, from fasting, but they're not going to continue to drop like 15 pounds a month afterwards. So we find initially with fasting, they get these larger drops. Of course, a lot of it is water loss, but they lose the most weight within the first couple of months. Then after that, it's sort of, the weight loss is sort of consistent between 0.5 pound to 1.5 pounds per person per week, depending on what they're doing for fasting. So we usually find that their first cholesterol test is just totally outrageous when they, after losing that initial chunk of weight. But as their weight loss stabilizes, even though the patient's continuing to lose weight, the cholesterol numbers sort of all go in expected trajectory. So the LDL usually declines a little bit, the HDL usually goes up, and the total cholesterol stays around high normal, and the triglycerides are very low, and the C-reactive protein is very low. So it usually stabilizes. So we do educate people on that at the start and tell them that their first 1 or 2 cholesterol tests are probably going to be a mess. Try to explain to them, their body's breaking down lots of fat, and there's all these different things going on in the body, and just to wait. So it's better to be proactive with the patients instead of, getting them in a panic state, preparing them for what the test results are going to be, and then just further reiterating that we're still learning so much more about what these numbers actually mean, and what are true markers of heart disease, and spend a little bit of time talking to them about what C-reactive protein is and what that means, and what their triglycerides actually mean. And usually we find people don't get too panicked about it, because we have those conversations with them in advance, and we really prepare them for the test results that are going to come. There's the odd cardiologist that sort of freaks out, Dr. Fung, periodically. But there's all kinds of great information out there, research coming out that shows, the relationship, particularly between saturated fats and heart disease, that there isn't much of a relationship there at all. And there's a lot of information coming out nowadays too about the importance that, or the role that insulin plays in heart disease. So usually when someone does approach Jason about this, we, or myself, we have quite the resource list to go back to and sort of send them some updated literature on that. And usually we don't create too many waves here. People are become quite open-minded, and they're willing to read the research that we send. So we're fortunate to have a community of more open-minded physicians. A lot of the biggest negative feedback, I guess I could say, that we get from physicians is that this program takes a lot of determination, like to be able to commit to doing intermittent fasting, to really be able to overhaul your diet. People don't there are a lot of physicians out there that just think people don't have the willpower or the drive to make such dramatic changes and to sustain them for a long period of time. But I think these physicians really underestimate, the motivation that these patients have. We see people and their lives are so miserable. They can't afford these expensive medications. They're too sick to travel. They're too sick to enjoy their families. Like, they're really willing to try. And no one's perfect. Dr. Fung's not perfect. I'm not perfect 100% of the time. You can't be. But it is actually really easy with practice to become perfect a good 90 to 95% of the time. And we really just try to create a warm and welcoming environment to our patients, so we keep them motivated and really express to them that, this year your diet might be 25% better, and next year it might be, 40% better. Maybe the year after it'll be 60% better. But as long as you're making progress, not to expect perfection, because then if you don't achieve it, then you're going to get into this emotional cycle where you're blaming yourself. You feel like you failed at another diet. You might as well go and eat all of this crappy food again that's going to make you sick. So I think a lot of these doctors, they really sort of underestimate the drive of a lot of these patients. And as long as I think you really express to patients that it's all about progress, not perfection, that really helps keep them motivated. So it's so cool to go into work every day and see people just being a little bit better and not expecting to be perfect. And every year their results keep improving. They keep losing weight. Their blood sugars keep staying better. They keep coming off of medication. They're feeling good, and they want to continue feeling good. So they're even more motivated to work on their diet and to fast. And I think we've been able to garner a lot of support now that we've been doing this for 5 years, and doctors locally have been seeing their patient be compliant and just continue to get better and not decline, but just to continue to make progress. So that's, I think, a big factor why we've got so much support here. And then Toronto too is the most culturally diverse city in the world. So there's so many people that participate in events like Ramadan. And I'd say prior to this, in my nephrology group, 30% of our patients participate in Ramadan every year. Used to really screw up my research, and now I'm begging everyone to do it. But it would screw up my research in the sense in the past that they would all improve, during this time when for certain factors, you were expecting them to sort of decline. They would all come off of medications, their kidney status would stabilize or improve. And that was against the norm. So sort of looking back, I think how naive was I to not notice this? Or, it was definitely noticed, I'll tell you that, but, not think about it in more detail as to why this is happening during this time. So a lot of our patients, over 50% of the population of Toronto was not born in the city of Toronto or in Canada. So Greek Orthodox, traditionally they fast for almost 200 days of the year. Now they fast for those many days of the year on bread, but everyone's very aware of how things were initially done. And how this fast was initially executed. So we have people from all different walks of life and all different religions who, for the most part, back home, wherever home was, fasting was a big part of their culture. So we've had a lot of success with those patients, and then their success and their just ability to be able to do this period motivates more of the patients who did grow up here in Canada and who grew up eating 7 times throughout the day. If they see a group of 20 people who can do this and get results, that's motivating to them. So I do think Jason Fung and I were really lucky geographically as to starting this, because half the people that come into our clinic, I'll be perfectly honest, say, all right, we did that when we were kids, time to do it again. And fasting is not a new thing to them because of where we're located. So it's, and they motivate the rest, which is good. So we do all of our follow-up appointments actually in small groups. We started out that way just because of huge time restrictions, and that Jason and I were doing this like on the side to our nephrology business. And then we decided we were going to invest more of our time into it. And we started seeing people one-on-one, and they started to decline, or they started to be too overwhelmed with the idea of fasting. So we brought them all back into groups. And, in every group, you have someone who's pretty much, fasted their whole lives till they moved to Canada, and then came to Canada and ate like garbage and became obese and diabetic. But they start fasting again and get great results. And then you have, the one, beyond motivated person who has read everything on the internet there is to read about fasting, and every book at a bookstore about it, and is eager to try something because they're well aware that the standard care doesn't work anymore. And then you always have two people that are semi-skeptical. So when you merge them all together, everyone gets motivated, they share stories, and then they make progress after that. So we found that group support with patients has been really important. I've had 2 patients in 5 years not request that they were not in groups because they didn't feel comfortable sharing. But most patients who are leery of the groups at first, they join 1 or 2 and they realize everyone's in the same boat as them. They're all on the same medications. They all have the same lab results. They all have the same weight issues. They're all getting the same blood sugar levels. And then they feel a sense of camaraderie. So then they end up, being very vocal and participating in the groups as an equal member, and they get a lot out of it. So the groups have been very vital, I think, for our success.
Fantastic. And that goes back to that community thing I was asking about. Also from a personal perspective, I've got a patient who has gone from in our sort of millimoles per mole 160, so way up, I think that's around 13 or 14, down to 62, so I think he's about 7.5 now. And his doctor put him in the paper, and it was fantastic. He was a truck driver, and he said exactly that. He'd been grabbing pies and sausage rolls on the go while he was driving, and eating at all times of the night, and just managed to structure his meals a bit better, reduce the amount of carbohydrate, and he was so excited about it. Like I said, they start off from a place of feeling unwell to this improvement in quality of life, and it's awesome to see. You spoke about time that you and Jason have invested in this, and now you two have a podcast. What can people expect from the Obesity Code podcast?
Oh, it's really cool. We're actually really proud of it. All the credit for this podcast goes to Carl Franklin of the
Hmm.
Two Keto Dudes. He's a real mastermind, and he spends about 14 hours editing every episode. So Carl's a true star of the podcast. But it's something we started up towards the end of 2017. The podcast airs Wednesday mornings in Toronto and Eastern time. So about 3 out of 4 podcasts have a featured patient story where we discuss this patient's journey. So Carl interviews the patient, and you learn about all the different trials and tribulations with their medical history and with their fasting and with their diet. Jason offers commentary more on sort of the science, because I'm the one that works with these patients in terms of fasting. He just adjusts their medication. So he talks a little bit more about the science, like why, if why someone's insulin levels would go down, during a fast, for example. And I'll talk a little bit more of the how she did it, or how he did it, and the why we chose this fasting regimen, more of the how-tos. And then some of our friends like Gary Tops, and they'll be on periodically too, discussing sort of their more area of expertise. So I believe our first Obesity Code podcast was on a client of mine named Marie Drake, who had a history of breast cancer, and she worked with a naturopathic doctor named Nasha Winters in the United States, who sort of specialized in ketogenic diets for cancer patients. And so Nasha was on that episode, sort of explaining a little bit more of what she sees in our clinic and how this is applicable. So we have some of our friends in the low carb community come on and offer their 2 cents and their advice on the topic that's being discussed during that episode too. Once a month, we do something a little bit offbeat. This past month, we did a Q&A with Jason and I, and it was a nice way to break things up. So we're going to be trying to do a Q&A once a month too. So people who write into Carl asking for questions, then we'll try to tackle those questions on the podcast. A lot of the times, people, there's so much information out there. And Jason and I, every day, there's about a dozen times a day, we see ourselves misquoted on social media. And then they'll say, well, how come Megan has a different view than Jason? And it's all like, neither one of us has either of those views that we're being quoted as having. So on this podcast, just to sort of clear up those issues and just sort of reinforce the message that Jason and I are actually trying to spread.
It's all right. And so you say there's a lot of information and a little bit of confusion out there. Where would you like to direct people if they want to get more information? Maybe 1 around fasting and 2 around what you guys do there in Toronto.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a blog on our website called idmprogram.com. So you can go to www.idmprogram.com and check out the blog on our website. There's a bunch of videos up there too. They're free videos that Jason has done talking about the development of insulin resistance and the etiology of obesity and what insulin toxicity actually is. So there's tons of great free information on the website. There are 2 programs. We have the individualized coaching program where you can join and work with one of our therapeutic fasting coaches, troubleshoot your issues specifically and help you figure out how to best incorporate fasting into your life and get the results. And we have a monthly membership subscription website that's got meal plans, recipes, Q&A videos, science videos to help us sort of explain to you the changes that's going on out there with new research coming out, either for or against fasting or for or against low carb dieting, so you understand what's a good research study, why something that might be anti-high fat, maybe it's just not a good study. And sort of looking out and discussing, the importance between understanding what a sample size actually means, that what is a correlation study? Is that a good study? Is that a bad study? So we're really trying to help educate everyone to read the literature, so they're not just reading headlines. And that's the biggest thing. We really want to educate people on actually how to read this literature for themselves, rather than read headlines or read articles written about the research from someone who might not know how to read the research effectively. So it's a great place to go to get information straight from the source. My colleague Jason Fung, he's written a couple of books, The Complete Guide to Fasting and the Obesity Code. And at the end of March, he has another book that's being released called The Diabetes Code. So that will be available at the end of March. And the books, they're like $15, $20. So not a whole lot of a financial investment for a lot of information. And I'm sorry about that. Not a whole lot of investment for some great information. So there's tons of free stuff on the website. There's a monthly subscription site for it's $39 a month. There's an individualized coaching program that's more of an executive program, and there's great books out there too by us too. So you can read it all, listen to it all, just sort of keep refreshing ourselves, sort of with what our philosophies are. And then the podcast is a great place to get some sort of updated and refreshed information too.
Fantastic. And I've heard a podcast with the fellow writer of The Complete Guide to Fasting, and it was cool how they sort of thought, well, where do we find information? Oh, we better write it. Very good. Is there any sort of pearls of wisdom that you'd like to share with people about your own health journey and not giving up and finding the answers? Is there anything that you sort of, how you approached it, that you'd like to share?
I think with a lot of us do everything to extremes. And I was one of those people. And I realized after a personal blunder in my mid-20s that I couldn't be someone who was extreme about everything. I had to learn to be a more moderate person and set smaller goals and build upon those goals, or else I was just going to fail miserably in life. And when I got diagnosed with diabetes, and when I gained about 100 pounds in a year, you sort of want to jump in with both feet and just do it all 100%. And I stopped and I took a few deep breaths and I said, every time you do that, you fail. So really writing down, having small goals, not blaming yourself for not being perfect. I went from one cheat meal a week to a cheat meal every 2 weeks to once a month to now maybe a couple times a year, once a year. It comes with time. And I think that you just be very patient, set smaller goals, and really celebrate those goals. The biggest issue I deal with patients is that they beat themselves up for not being perfect all of the time. Well, I can tell you there's very few people out there who are going to be perfect on Christmas Day. So you can't have an all or nothing perspective on this, because then what happens is if you go off track on Christmas Day, then you feel bad about it. Then you go off track for like 3 months afterwards, and you just become more sick in that time. And now it's going to take more time to undo that damage if it can be undone. So to really sort of give yourself a break, give yourself a good pat on the back, and just remember that it is progress, not perfection, and to be really mindful of small goals and celebrate those small goals. I tell people, I said, there was one time, it's about 1.5 years ago now, we just had a terrible, terrible night. I had a nephew who was newborn get rushed to the hospital with potentially liver failure. We had a cousin's significant other who we were close to as a family. His heart just stopped while he was playing basketball, and he was 22 years old, all in one night. And everything was just super crazy. And I was at one hospital with the baby, and I craved green tea. And I started laughing in the waiting room like a lunatic because I just wanted green tea. It was, I didn't want pretzels. I didn't want potato chips. I didn't want a chocolate bar or a cookie. I wanted green tea, and green tea was what I felt I needed to comfort me. And that was just so crazy for me to experience. So just to be patient out there, because, if you fall off your bike, that's fine. Get back on it. If you fall off with your diet, that's fine. Get back on it. And just getting back on it consistently will, bring you to a period in your life where when things are really stressful, you'll crave green tea and you're not going to crave that McDonald's. So it's really cool to see these things pay off. So just be patient and these things will pay off.
Thank you so much, Megan. I'll let you get on with the rest of your day, and I'll kick into the rest of mine. It's been an absolute pleasure, and so many gems there, and I hope my audience enjoys that as well. Thank you.
Thanks you, Ryan. Thanks, everyone. Bye.